These are the 5 things I want to see the most out of Persona 6. Hello everybody, I am Jmulls of Jmulls Gaming. I reacted to what you all wanted out of Persona 6, and now it's time for me to pay the Pied Piper, to provide a list of things of my own that I personally want to see when it comes to Persona 6. These aren't things that I think will make the game sell well, or be received well, or anything like that. These are just what I personally want to see. I talked about this before Metaphor ReFantazio, but after playing that game and letting it digest, it's changed a lot of my opinions about just how I feel about turn-based combat on the whole. And this really segues nicely into my first point, the press turn system. I want it. Like, I understand completely Shin Megami Tensei already exists. I get that. Metaphor ReFantazio, though, made me fall in love with the press turn system, and I already enjoyed Persona combat, but the press turn system is just a version of that combat that resonates with me more. I love the strategy, I love how more important buffs and debuffs are within the confines of the press turn system, namely agility. Missing, dodging, absorbing or repelling feel far more consequential with the press turn system than it does in Persona, where it could be just a mild inconvenience. It can feel crippling either for you or for the enemy, and I love the manipulation around the press turn system. With it, it can easily feel as if the game is overwhelming, as if it's out to get you, and the enemies just have an easy way to counter you every step of the way. But when you learn the press turn system and learn to utilize it to your advantage, I love how that entire perspective, that entire dynamic gets shifted on its head, and all of a sudden you feel so powerful because you're playing smartly. You understand the gameplay systems, you understand the mechanics and how they work, and you understand the strategy involved. It's an element that I really enjoy with the press turn system. For me, I love Persona, but generally speaking, when I get closer to the end of the game and the farther I get into the game, it just gets a bit too easy, even when I go to hard mode or something like that, and a lot of the combat can feel hyper repetitive to me outside of certain boss fights. But I just don't get that feel out of the press turn system, and I'm most of the way through Shin Megami Tensei 3 Nocturne at this point, and I still don't feel like that. It's not like it's perfect or anything, it just resonates with me more. And if Persona 6 wants to follow the success of Metaphor ReFantazio and implement the press turn system, it was originally a Shin Megami Tensei spin-off after all. I can understand why it would be off-putting for some people, but personally speaking, I would eat it up and love it. But speaking of Metaphor ReFantazio, that goes into my second point here. And I don't want any of what I'll call filler social link events. I just don't want them at all. To define precisely what I mean, you know in Persona when you're trying to level up a social link or a confidant, but you didn't get enough reputation the last time you hung out with them, so you now have to do this like filler event where you just do like an insert any event here. There's not really any dialogue, it's like one line of dialogue, nothing really advances, and then it says, next time you hang out with this person, you might become closer. I understand there's some strategy involved and incentivization to select the right dialogue options during the social link events to try and avoid those elements, because the calendar system is all about scheduling. It's just an aspect and an element to the scheduling that I don't enjoy, and I feel it more limiting than anything, because sometimes I may want to select a dialogue option because it fits my mental version of the character more, or I just find it funny, I want to see what happens there, and if I want to see that, I either have to save scum it or grit my teeth and select an option that I may not want to hit, necessarily speaking from a personal perspective, but I assume or know that it will give me more reputation with that character, and I don't particularly view that to be interesting. In Metaphor ReFantazio, it's just, if you hung out with this person, you leveled up that social link. Called a follow in that game, and experiencing it in that light there, I think I just prefer that overall. However, I don't think social links / confidants should necessarily just be a linear story, where there's no consequence at all. And this goes to my third point. Point number 3, I think it would be really cool to have branching social link stories that aren't just for you either romance this character or you friendzone the character. Let me like alter the events of the actual social link somehow, to some degree. Let me feel as as if my choices actually matter in that context, because that would be an element of choice and strategy that would appeal more to me than, say, if you don't select the right choices here, here, and here, you're gonna have to waste a day or two just spamming this repetitive event you've probably already seen 15 times before or whatever, and it just largely feels like filler. I would rather have that element of player choice come in a way that actually feels meaningful and gives me a level of agency over the events that are actually happening. It doesn't need to be like a Path of Exile skill tree or anything like that. Just a few choices, maybe here or there, maybe a couple of different endings for at least a few of the social links. I think that could add a lot to the system overall and move it in a more healthy direction, or at least a more engaging and exciting direction, because sometimes the social links can feel a bit okay, or just not that impactful. But when they do hit well, I think they hit extremely well. And I think this would be another avenue to allow them to just hit even harder than they already do. Ideally for me, with point 2 and 3 being no filler social link events alongside having branching social link stories, one, I think that could add replayability, which I like out of Persona, but it also removes the fluff and the uninteresting elements while substituting in intriguing storylines or plot progression, and in my opinion would also just round out the pacing overall. Gets me more meaningful story, ideally speaking, if executed well, and less just, let's go out and have a cup of coffee so that next time in a week when you hang out with me, we'll actually have something important and engaging happening here. But let's transition back to the combat for a second here, and let's go to point number 4. Better dungeon design, because I think this has historically been one of Persona's weakest elements to me. I didn't like Tartarus, either in Portable or in Reload, that much. I like the aesthetic variety of the dungeon design in Persona 4, but the actual layout and gameplay of them leaves a lot to be desired in Persona 4, specifically for me. I think I just do not gravitate to the linear corridor style Persona used to be really known for, and still kind of has when it comes to Mementos and P5. It makes the dungeon design just feel stale, repetitive, and lackluster on the whole, and their attempts to add flavor and variety don't really land because I can't get past the overarching problem that I have with the dungeon design being hyper repetitive. I think Persona 5, I was gonna say specifically Royal, but both versions of P5 probably have my favorite dungeons of the Persona games that I've played. Metaphor's an interesting case study because I think they are hit or miss there, but generally I view them to be more hits than anything. I like how they still focus a lot on the actual combat, which helps a lot since I love the press turn system, but I do feel as if I'm exploring an actual location. I can go off the beaten path, discover certain things. I think Metaphor could have leaned into that element a bit more, and I like having storytelling happen during the dungeons. I think P5 did a pretty good job of this, whereas in pretty much every dungeon you went to in that game, the story for the character, or not just the character of the palace, but also of the party, can progress within the dungeon. May not be anything big or historic, but just having something, to me, feels better in terms of the overall experience, but also the pacing, then, okay, go through like 5 to 20 floors of just randomly generated, at least it feels like it, corridors intermixed together, and just fight after fight after fight after fight, random event, fight after fight after fight. More handcrafted levels that feel as if they have purpose behind them. Events that happen in the dungeon, progressing the story, having character development, whether that be for the antagonist or the protagonist, happen within the dungeons. Like what happens in Metaphor ReFantazio or in Persona. Or even occasionally in P4, because P4 kind of does that as well, just not to the degree that I'm really looking for. Though I wouldn't call it bad or anything. I don't want to just be a bunch of gimmicks, and the focus should be on the combat, absolutely. But I don't think it should just be combat. I want it to be exploration. I want to uncover these locations, go off the beaten path, find really cool loot, have a few extra choices and decisions that I can make inside the dungeon. One of my favorite moments in all of Metaphor ReFantazio happens at the very beginning of the game in the first tutorial cave dungeon, where you stroll up against a dragon who is sleeping and you get the choice. You can sneak around him and avoid a really tough battle at that point in time, or if you want to bash your head up against that wall and fight the dragon, if you manage to take him down, you'll get a really good piece of loot for it. Now, I don't think Metaphor ReFantazio really does that a ton after that point, but I love that moment in particular, because it just feels good and satisfying to take down that dragon and get a really good sword that can carry you for a couple of arcs with Stroll. And I think having events like that happen in Persona can also work, because it kind of does that each game with the Reaper, that's largely just relegated to the end game. I think having a few moments moments like that happen every now and then could be really nice and satisfying and just round out the overall dungeon experience. I would love to see that. Now, I'm gonna kind of double up on point 4 here with better dungeon design. You can kind of view this to be, for that to have been like 4A, this to be 4B. The side dungeons need work. Persona 5 Mementos, I wouldn't say it's a particular big strength. I think Mementos was handled better in Royal compared to vanilla P5, but it's still like, ugh. Because again, it suffers from just a bunch of corridors slapped together syndrome. And like a slight visual variety when it comes to the overall aesthetic, going from like section to section, but still kind of feels the same. And then in Metaphor v Fantasio, my weakest element, my biggest critique of that game was the side dungeons. They felt hyper repetitive to me and suffer from that linear corridor syndrome again that I just don't vibe with. If you're going to do side dungeons, I want them to feel purposeful and not just, here's an excuse to have a bunch of fights and to grind a bit. I like that element they had in Persona 5 where, specifically in Royal, where you could like augment the reward structure out of Mementos if you wanted more gold, money, or if you wanted more items, or if you wanted more XP. You can like spec into that. I think that's a system that could be really expanded on, fleshed out, and iterated. I don't have any particular leaning towards do one ever-expanding dungeon throughout the entire game for the side dungeons, or do a series of extra side dungeons, or even do what P4 does and just says, hey, for the side quests, go back to the dungeons you already did before. If the dungeon design is good, then I don't mind stuff like that. But I think Atlas is really missing out on having memorable dungeon design, specifically from side content, by leaning too much on formulaic design. I think moving away from that idea could be drastically beneficial for Persona 6. Now, for my final point, what I want out of Persona 6, I kind of want a vibe more akin to Persona 4. For those who don't know, I love Persona 4. And while a lot of my Persona content lately has been about Persona 3, because, you know, Reload, Persona 4 is the one that I would mostly point to and say is probably my favorite. Despite honestly having like my least favorite dungeon design in Persona. And it's just the vibe. I love it so much. The comedy just hits for me. The characterization, I love it so much. I love every character in the game. I even like Teddy. And I love how Persona 4 is able to shuffle between these big bouts of bombastic comedy alongside really emotional and heartfelt character moments. But there's an element to Persona 4 that I think 5 and 3 really lack, and I think is absolutely valuable, and that is the location of Inaba. It feels like it has personality all of its own, despite the fact it's just a location. And I think it doesn't necessarily have to be a small town. I don't think that's why Inaba was so beloved and why I love it so much. But they made that place, that location, feel as if you explored all of it. It didn't just feel like insert big city here, it had personality all to its own. You understood the local specialities there, how local store owners felt about Juness, and the whole economy of Inaba, how they focused in on like selling steak and they were kind of known for that. But also all the side content you could do in Persona 4, I really liked. Being able to use your motorcycle, well, motorcycle in like quotations there, to go around and explore and uncover new locations to do new activities like fishing at the ocean and stuff like that. Oh, it's been a while. I think you could fish at the ocean. I like those elements. I think it adds personality to Inaba. I think the game that gets closest to that is like P3 a bit. I just think I vibe with the way P4 handled that more. And if you ask me what I care about more in a story, character development or world building, I will always side with character development personally. However, I think great stories have both. And I'm not saying 5 and 3 don't have good world building, I just think 4 is a step above. Again, this isn't a point saying that I want P6 to be set in a small town. What I want them to do is focus in a lot on the location that it's set in, though. Really develop it, flesh it out, make me understand that part, that world, the location that the game plays in. Make it feel important, make it feel like home. Like, I think the closest Persona has gotten to that feeling in regard for me is like the dorm from P3 or the cafe from P5, and those are only buildings. But they feel memorable. And it's just that P4 has that feeling and elicits that feeling for the entire location, pretty much. I think I'm also just a really big Persona 4 simp. Like, I do think that's part of it, but again, if you ask me what I want out of Persona 6, that would be an element that I think is really important. I don't think it's the most important element that would go into Persona 6, but I think it's a very undervalued element. And the more I think about it, I think that's a large reason why I love P4 so much. The entire game has that personality behind it, not just in the characterization, how strong it is in P4, but also in the town and the location. And good God, do I love the soundtrack in P4 and how I think it just adds to the feeling of the location. Persona just does this overall extremely well. But P4, near the end, exploring Inaba with snowflakes playing. If you know the song, you know what I mean. It just hits, dude. It just hits. And if I can get that feeling out of Persona 6, I'd be one happy gamer. And with that, I'll call the video there for the day. Thank you all for tuning in. My pleasure making the video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and subscribe and comment down below with what you would love to see out of Persona 6. Don't just limit yourself to 1 point if you want. Let me know exactly what you would love to see out of Persona 6. I'd love to hear your thoughts, see your opinions, and to hear your perspectives. Stay safe, have a great day, go play some video games, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye, everybody. Until we meet again!